Hey everyone, and welcome to the Quimper Geological Society event. We are so glad to have you all here today. Hello, hello. My name is Rebecca Koronowski, and I am the Education and Engagement Manager at Jefferson Land Trust. And I'm here at the top to give you just a few tips on using Zoom before we get started. So first up, we will have our audience mics muted for the duration of the event so that we can hear our speakers. But it is up to you if you would like to have your video on or off. It's nice for our presenters and for all of us to get to see who's in the audience here today. But if you're more comfortable with your video off, you can turn that off using the icon that looks like a camcorder in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. For the majority of the presentation, Ben will be using screen share to share some slides with you. And so the best way to view that is in what's called speaker view with side-by-side mode. So if you're in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, if you're on a computer, you can choose a couple of different view options. If side-by-side mode isn't available for you, you can also click in the black bar that's on top of the thumbnails of different people's videos to minimize the previews of the videos so that they are not on top of the screen share. You can also click in that black bar and move the thumbnails around if they're in the way of something that you'd like to see on the screen. We will have the chat function available for our audience here. So I'll type in just a little chat there so you can see where that is coming up. It's in the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. In the center there, it's a little speech bubble icon that says chat. If you're on a tablet or a phone, you may have to click the three dots menu and then select chat in order to get there. And this function will also be how we collect questions for the Q&A at the end of the event. So do find that there and feel free to send questions throughout the event or any other comments that you have. It's fun to have a conversation going with you all as the presentation is rolling. So we'll plan to end at about 5 o'clock, at which point we'll do some Q&A with Ben. So stick around for that and get all of your questions answered. So at the top here, I'd like to start by asking you all a question via a poll. And so the two questions are, where are you from and what is your geologic background? And so if you're on a computer, you can click with your mouse and make sure you select both answers and then press submit. And if you're on a tablet or a device, you can just tap on those and then click submit. And we're just curious to know who you are in the audience here, where you're coming from, and what background do you have? As the host here, I don't get to answer the questions, so I'll tell you out loud that I am from Port Townsend, and my background is in, I have undergraduate study in geology. And this is helpful for us in a couple of ways. As we're going through these presentations, we've done so many of these on Zoom now. It's really helpful to see how our audience changes both over time and with different topics. So it looks like most of you have voted, so I'll give it just another second here for you to submit. And if there isn't an answer that suits you, feel free to send in those other options into the chat or add any clarifications. So I'll end this poll and share the results with you all. And so, Michael, we're trending here, having a Port Townsend focus, which is not surprising, as that's where the Quimper Geological Society headquarters are. And additionally, we have quite a few folks who do not have a geologic background, which also isn't too surprising, especially given the topic today. So I imagine we may have some biologists in the room as well. So I'll pass the mic on over to Michael Michette, the lead of the Quimper Geological Society. And it looks like you are having a good time over there. Michael, what is going on?
Yes, Thank you very much. Currently in the Caribbean. That's why I couldn't facilitate this meeting. Sarah's going to do it today. Just a few news notes I want to tell you about for the Geological Society here, the Quimper one. On April 10th, that's about 6 weeks from now, Trevor Contreras, from a geologist from the Department of Natural Resources, is going to be giving a talk on one of his hobby subjects, which is carving rock, and jewelry and sculptures and that sort of thing. So his title will be Geology and the Art of Stone Carving. I haven't seen the abstract yet, but I'm already interested in it. It's going to be a fun thing to do. And then again, about 6 weeks later, on May 22nd, Jennifer Pierce, who I knew since she was a toddler, and she's a third generation geologist, grandfather, father, and now she's professor of geology at Boise State University. She has a background in fire science. So she's going to give a talk about wildfires, climate, and erosion, which coming in May will probably be a topic we're hearing about from the mountain areas. So those are our two remaining talks for the spring. Another thing I want to mention, if you have friends that couldn't make this titillating lecture today on beavers, you can see a recording of it on our website. It'll be up, the link will be up on it in a couple, 3 or 4 days, midweek or so. And ask them if they'd like to see the recording after it's done. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah Spaith. Sarah is a long-term employee of the, I gotta get my screen reduced here, sorry. She's a longtime employee of the Jefferson Land Trust. She was formerly the executive director. She grew up in the Northwest, in Seattle, in the San Juan Islands, and has a true love for land and its animals. Sarah's now currently the Director of Conservation and oversees projects and partnerships at the Land Trust. She's well known throughout the county. I suspect she knows 3/4 of the people in the county. She's just everywhere. She works closely with the landowners and community members, as well as government and nonprofit agencies, to shepherd our land projects through to a point of protection. So Sarah, take over now to
Thanks, Michael. And hi, everyone. I am really excited to be here today, and I'm really honored to introduce Ben Goldfarb, who's our guest speaker today. And I just met Ben, but I was first exposed to his work and his wit through my favorite podcast, The Wild. And Ben was sharing his passion and knowledge with Chris Morgan, who's the host of that podcast. So it really inspired me to get his book, and I'm currently immersed in this book. It's such a great read, Ben. I'm just really enjoying it a lot. And I'm just struck with how timely and relevant this treatise is on beavers, and especially to the conservation and restoration efforts in our local watersheds like the Chimacum Creek and Tarboo Creek watersheds. We have some landowners that are struggling to coexist with beavers, who are hard at work doing their thing, taking down trees that were planted along Chimacum Creek to buffer the salmon habitat and to shade the salmon habitat and keep the creek cold. We also have other landowners like Scott and Susan Freeman in Tarboo watershed, who welcome the return of the beavers to restore the complex wetland and ecological functions of the watershed. And the Susan's family, the Leopold family, have a long history of that kind of restoration work. So we've got kind of the wild range of attitudes around beaver. And I'm just really thankful for this time with you, Ben, today, because you have tackled this complex subject in a beautiful and thorough way. Ben's book on beavers won the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award and was named the best book of 2018 by the Washington Post. And his environmental journalism has also appeared in the Atlantic, Science, the New York Times, Outside Magazine, High Country News, and many other publications. So welcome, Ben, and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. And thanks to you, Michael and Rebecca, for hosting, and to all of you for being here. I really appreciate you spending your Saturday afternoon with us. So let me just share my screen here. And Okay, great. So, so I live in Spokane, a pretty beavery place in its own right. But I've been very fortunate to make it out to your neck of the woods a number of times over the last few years, and have been to Tarboo Creek and have seen some of the beaver activity there. And yeah, you guys live in just a fantastic, wonderful beavery corner of Washington. And I hope to visit again this summer. So today I'll be talking a lot about, of course, how beavers shape the landscape and how we can use beaver activity in an ecological restoration context. But I thought it'd be appropriate to just begin with some kind of basic beaver biology and life history. I mean, what are these animals that shape the landscape in such profound and beneficial ways? What is a beaver exactly? Well, of course, beavers are rodents. They're semi-aquatic rodents. So they spend all of their lives in and around water. They're pretty big. They're 40 to 50 pounds as a fully grown beaver. And I think this is actually a good point, Rebecca, for our first poll question. If you want to throw a poll question up there. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so they're North America's largest native rodent. What is the world's largest rodent? I know you guys are mostly geologists, but I guess there are some wildlife biologists out there too. So capybara is in a pretty solid lead right now. And I'll just say that, yeah, that's you guys are, so the capybara is the overwhelming favorite, and in fact that is right. Capybaras are well over 100 pounds, so they're pretty hefty. But beavers are the second largest rodent in the world. Koipu and nutria are actually the same animal. I just threw that in there to try to trip you guys up, but you're clearly too good. So beavers, of course, as I said, they're semi-aquatic rodents. So they spend all of their lives in and around water, and they've got all kinds of really fabulous adaptations for this semi-aquatic life they lead in this niche that they fill. First, they've got incredibly dense fur, of course, which was ultimately their undoing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But beavers actually have as many individual hairs on a postage stamp size patch of skin as we have our entire heads. So they've got remarkably dense fur. They have these wonderful webbed duck-like hind feet. So they're very powerful, agile swimmers. A beaver can stay underwater for up to 15 minutes. So they're very good at holding their breath naturally. They've got a second set of eyelids, kind of transparent eyelids called nictitating membranes, which act as goggles underwater. And then they've got, my favorite beaver adaptation is that they actually have a second set of lips, kind of this fur-lined, almost like a valve behind their front teeth. So they can close that valve and then chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. I think that's a pretty amazing one. And then what's a beaver's most iconic feature? What makes a beaver recognizably a beaver? Well, the tail, of course. And I'm sure that all of you have spent time in and around wetlands and ponds, and you've probably heard the iconic tail slap of a beaver. Well, that's an alarm call, right? They're signaling to other beavers that a predator, probably you, is nearby. But the tail's also a fat storage device. They put on fat for the winter in their tails. It's a kickstand when they're out on land. It's a rudder while they're swimming. So the tail has all kinds of useful functions. And then the other wonderful beaver feature, of course, is their teeth. As you can see, they've got these wonderful, almost chisel-like incisors. The top and bottom sets of incisors basically grind together and sort of file each other into these wonderful chisel-like points. And the teeth, as you can see, are orange. And the reason for that is that they're actually chemically and structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their food. So their teeth are very powerful and durable, which of course is helpful when you spend your whole life cutting down trees, right? Beavers, of course, they fell trees, and they do that for two reasons. I mean, first, of course, is that they're eating the inner bark, the cambium of the tree. That's kind of the sugary layer that does the growing. So, preferred beaver food trees, of course, the big three in the American West are cottonwood, aspen, willow, But they'll eat just about any deciduous tree. They do tend to avoid conifers, but on the peninsula, they do take down red cedar sometimes, which is pretty interesting. And I'm not really sure they do that anywhere else. That seems like a kind of a unique behavior of Western Washington beavers potentially, because I've seen that a number of times out in your neck of the woods. I've never seen that elsewhere. So if anybody has more information about that, I would be curious too. And then of course, in addition to eating the cambium, they're also eating all kinds of green herbaceous vegetation as well. Water lilies, cattails. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. They eat grass very happily. So you're really choosy generalists is what scientists call them. They've got a few species of plant that they really prefer, but they'll eat just about anything. So of course, in addition to felling trees to eat that cambium, they're also using the wood as construction material. And there are two basic types of beaver structure. The first, of course, is the lodge. That's kind of the fundamental beaver housing unit. You can sort of see in this picture, there are underwater tunnels that generally lead up and into the lodge. And inside the lodge, you've got kind of an elevated nesting chamber platform above the water line. And inside that lodge, you've got the colony or the family of beavers. And that's generally the male and female, typically mate for life, the breeding male and female, the newborn kits, the baby beavers who are born in the spring, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So you've got at times 3-year classes of offspring all cohabitating in that lodge. And then in their second year, those 2-year-olds will disperse out and look for their own territories, like teenagers heading off for college or something. So then in addition to the lodge, of course, the other basic beaver structure is the dam. So why do beavers do this? Why do beavers build dams? What's the point of this very specialized, kind of bizarre, unique behavior? Well, a beaver on land, as one biologist put it to me, is a fat, slow, smelly package of meat, right? They get eaten by bears, wolves, cougars, coyotes in some cases. Any large carnivore is going to destroy a beaver on land. So by building that dam and creating that nice deep impoundment of water, of course, they're enhancing the extent of their own shelter, their own habitat. So instead of having to walk overland to a good looking tree and maybe get eaten by a cougar along the way, now they can swim to it instead and be comparatively safe. And I found this beaver remnant in Minnesota, and this is a beaver that was predated by a wolf. So wolves actually eat the entirety of the beaver, pelt, bones, and all that's left behind is the mandible and lower incisors. That's very kind of characteristic of a wolf. So the takeaway is that you don't want to be a beaver on land, right? You want to stay in the water. So these dams that they build come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. A typical beaver colony is building, at times a dozen or more dams. And generally that's, there's one big primary dam and then a number of sort of smaller secondary dams further upstream. And, this is kind of a small secondary dam in Montana, probably a foot high and 3 feet long, a very modest little structure, but they do get quite a bit bigger. Here's a nice specimen this is also in Minnesota in Voyageurs National Park, which is probably the world's, or at least the country's leading beaver mecca. And this dam is 15 feet high and probably 600 feet long, and is obviously the work of many successive generations of beavers, all adding their stick to the wall. So of course, these beaver dams can create really enormous impoundments, right? Here's, again, this is also in Voyageurs National Park. This is an impoundment of several hundred acres made by a single beaver dam. And I'm always impressed at how sort of hydrologically sophisticated or savvy they seem to be. I often go to a stream and say, okay, if you sent an engineer from the Army Corps to this stream and said, build a dam that minimizes labor and maximizes the impoundment, they would put the dam in the exact spot that the beavers did. So this pond is the work of one beaver dam at the kind of the narrow constriction of a stream, kind of the outflow of this canyon, and they've obviously chosen a very good spot for that dam. Then the other kind of really important beaver landscape modification that doesn't get enough credit, I don't think, is their canal networks. In addition to being wonderful builders, they're also very adept diggers, and they excavate these elaborate canal networks that, again, allow them to forage up in the forest without walking over land. And these canal networks can be hundreds of meters long and really increase the spatial extent of the water that they're spreading out across the landscape. So the canals are also a really important feature. And when it all comes together, this is what it looks like. This is a beaver complex near Leadville, Colorado, up by the Continental Divide. So this is probably 12,000 feet or so. So they really get way up in the drainages. And here you can see, this stream, is just sort of this nice sine wave, this single threaded channel until it hits the beaver complexes. Here, all of these linear features here are beaver dams. And you can also see some canals out here as well. And you can see that these dams are holding hundreds of thousands of gallons of water in this little valley here, and really, sort of irrigating or hydrating this little wetland. Again, at about 12,000 feet. So that's a pretty cool, I think, example of what they're capable of. So of course, beavers are building these dams and creating these impoundments to enhance their own habitat. But in the process, they're also creating habitat for lots of other creatures as well, right? We know that, in the American West, water is life, and any animal capable of creating or expanding the extent of water is really ecologically crucial. Beavers are what biologists call a keystone species. So in architecture, the keystone is the top block in a stone arch. And if you pull that block, the arch crumbles, right? And beavers are playing that same role in aquatic ecosystems. They're disproportionately supporting a lot of other animals. A few examples. Here's a great blue heron rookery that I came across at a beaver pond in Wisconsin. Of course, every wading bird and species of waterfowl are very important beaver beneficiaries, as well as songbirds. Passerines, warblers, flycatchers. They all do really well in kind of the shrubby willow. It grows up along beaver complexes. That's very good perching, nesting, foraging habitat for songbirds. So all kinds of bird, avian beneficiaries, moose and other semi-aquatic mammals, mink, muskrat, otters are all doing really well in and around beaver complexes. Here, I think, is a cool example of beaver habitat enhancement. So this is also in Voyageurs National Park, which again has just the most incredible beaver infrastructure. But you would see this sort of thing in the American West now too. So here, you can sort of see, here's the old Beaver Dam, which at some point a few years back breached, and and the pond drained. So this whole kind of lush, wet meadow, right, is the footprint of a former beaver pond. And then here's the lodge, which is obviously unoccupied. But after this pond drained, a pack of wolves actually moved into this lodge and raised their pups in there. So that's beavers creating habitat for their direct predator. I think that's really incredible. And then, of course, the other absolutely crucial beaver beneficiary is salmonids. This is a juvenile steelhead, and of course, baby salmonids, they don't want to live in the main stem river, right? They're just going to get blown downstream by the force of the current. They want to live in a deep pool or a backwater or a side channel or a meander, some kind of, they really like complex, slow water refuge habitat, especially coho salmon, which spend an extra winter in fresh water. And of course, beavers create that kind of complex, slow water refuge habitat. So there's just a vast body of literature showing enhanced salmonid production in and around beaver complexes. And that's really what's driving a lot of beaver restoration in Washington state now is that salmon connection. Of course, there are still plenty of anglers and a few fish biologists who say, well, wait a second, we're trying to take structures out of streams right now, right? We're removing dams on the Elwha River. Why would we want to put more dams back into streams? But of course, beaver dams and human dams are nothing alike. Beavers or fish rather, jump over beaver dams. They swim around them during periods of high flow. They wriggle through them at times. There's certainly lots of literature showing individual steelhead, for example, passing more than 200 beaver dams on their way to spawn. And here's a nice picture. This is somewhere in the Cascades. This is a stream that I visited a few years ago, and here you can see, here's the beaver dam, here's the downstream side, here's the upstream side, and here are the two freshly excavated coho salmon redds or nests. So obviously at least two fish had no problem whatsoever passing this beaver dam. And in fact, the evolutionary connection between beavers and salmonids is so deep that it inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which is that beavers taught salmon to jump. I think that gets at it nicely. So how many beavers were in North America originally? What was the extent of all of these habitat creation and modification benefits? What did North America look like with its full complement of beavers? That's a question that I think about a lot. So first, I think it's important to remember just how many beavers there were. We don't have a great population estimate, but the best guess is that there were as many as 400 million beavers in North America prior to the industrial fur trade. Those hundreds of millions of beavers would have created hundreds of millions of beaver ponds, right? It stands to reason, which cumulatively would have impounded just a vast extent. My best kind of back of the envelope calculation is that somewhere around 230,000 square miles of this continent were underwater thanks to beavers. And for reference, that's about the size of Arizona and Nevada put together. So it's really hard to understate, or to overstate rather, the historic impact of these critters. And a lot of what I tried to do in my book was just go back through old explorers' journals, trappers' diaries, railroad survey reports, Native American oral histories, trying to ascertain what a fully beavered landscape would have looked like. And there were just some wonderful observations out there. Explorers crossing the state of Indiana and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had so thoroughly mucked everything up. Here's a nice observation, I think, from Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame, who was actually a really great naturalist and beaver observer. And this is in the Missouri Basin in Montana. He observed, he himself and Clark seeing beaver dams in every single tributary of the Missouri as far as the eye could see up into the mountains. And he's observing this sort of thing every day in the Missouri Basin. So that was in 1805 that Lewis and Clark saw beavers everywhere in the state of Montana. In 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, of course, the naturalist and painter, traveled the exact same route looking for a beaver to paint. And he couldn't find a beaver in the entire Missouri Basin, where just 40 years earlier, Lewis and Clark had seen them everywhere. So what happened to beavers in just 4 decades? Where did they go? What did they turn into? Well, of course, they became hats, right? I think a lot of people hear the phrase beaver hat, and they think of like a big, fluffy, Davy Crockett-like thing, but in fact, beaver hats were sort of these elegant Victorian top hats that were all the rage back in Europe and on the East Coast. The reason, incidentally, that beavers make such good hats is they have 2 layers of fur. They have the kind of the long here, actually a beaver pelt here that I bought off a trapper. I don't know how you can see this, but they've got these long kind of coarse outer guard hairs. And then underneath that, they've got this kind of softer, this softer under fur, what trappers call the beaver wool. And if you looked at those under hairs under a microscope, you'd see that each one has a little sort of hook or barb at the end that causes them to lock together like Velcro, which just makes a really good, durable, malleable, waterproof felt. So beavers, the fur trade sort of begins in New England in the early 1600s. And spreads west and south from there. By the early 1800s, it's reached the West Coast. By the 1820s, it's reached the kind of the northern Rockies and the inland West. And by 1850 or so, beavers are functionally extinct in the lower 48 states. And it's really hard to again, it's hard, I keep saying it's hard to overstate, but it really is hard to overstate sort of beaver's historic, ecological, and social role. But practically every major historic event prior to the Civil War has some kind of beaver connection. The Louisiana Purchase, that was partly inspired by Jefferson's desire to secure more trapping grounds. Even the American Revolution, one of the British offenses that angered the colonists was denying them access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. And of course, it was beaver trappers and traders who spread smallpox and many of the other diseases that so ravaged many Native American tribes. So the story of the fur trade is really the story of early American history and all of its kind of grandiosity and tragedy. Here's one example, I think, of how deeply embedded beavers were in early economies. This is a beaver coin that was minted by the Oregon Territory, which really encompassed basically all of the Northwest. And the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt. So the entire economy of the Northwest operated on the pelt standard. I think that's a pretty remarkable testament to this animal's historic importance. So, in addition to being this hugely significant historical event, the fur trade was also a very dramatic ecological event, right? I mean, what happens when you kill hundreds of millions of beavers? Well, hundreds of millions of beaver dams break and hundreds of millions of acres of beaver ponds drain to the ocean. And this just, we don't really think about the fur trade in the same terms as we think about the deforestation of New England or the busting of the Midwestern prairie that led to the Dust Bowl, or gold mining in the Sierra Nevada. We don't think about the fur trade as being this kind of seminal ecological catastrophe, but there's no question that it was. Of course, in a beaver-rich stream, all of those beaver dams are acting as speed bumps, right? They're slowing water down, spreading it out, forcing it out of the floodplain, encouraging kind of that surface groundwater connection. But when you lose all of those beaver-built speed bumps, there's nothing checking the velocity of water. And time and time again, you see this really dramatic erosion and incision. And this is a stream. This is in Wyoming. This is actually in Yellowstone National Park. This is a stream that lost its beavers, and of course you end up sort of degrading this channel that had taken thousands of years of sediment accumulation to build up. So I think that we tend to look at this sort of stream, right, which is all over the American West, and say, well, this is probably the result of unmanaged grazing or mining or some other impact. But I think in many cases, this sort of really dramatic incision is a legacy of beaver trapping. And of course, the loss of all of that pond and wetland habitat and that floodplain connectivity was obviously catastrophic for all kinds of species. We don't really know the extent of the damage, but for example, here's a Boreal Toad, a species that in much of its range is basically an obligate beaver pond breeder, only breeds in beaver ponds. So what did it mean for the Boreal Toad that beavers were extirpated? I mean, certainly it would have been a catastrophe. Interestingly, Peter Bales from the Northwest Watershed Institute just sent me this great paper from the Chimicum watershed up in your neck of the woods that really got at this nicely. This is a great find by Peter, and I appreciate it. And he, this paper basically, or this report basically found that the loss of beaver ponds in the Chimicum watershed and the loss of other kinds of water features basically eliminated 97% of the historic winter rearing habitat for coho salmon, which is just incredible to think about. So that's a dramatic impact from beaver extirpation in your own backyard. So fortunately, by 1900 or so, society begins to wise up. And to slowly reintroduce beavers, mostly using stock from Canada and Yellowstone and a couple other little reservoirs. And beavers are reintroduced in Washington, Oregon, California, state of New York. Beavers start to recover. They got down to about 100,000 or so at around the turn of the 20th century. Again, nearly all in Canada. But the population pretty quickly starts to increase. And I think that Rebecca, here's maybe a good point for our second poll question. about sort of the global extent of beaver populations. So the question is, which of the following countries has never had a wild beaver population? So I encourage you guys to throw your vote in there. I'll just give it a minute and let it play out. Ireland's in the lead, but Mongolia, Italy, Argentina are all catching up. Okay, so the crowd once again is correct. It is Ireland. Was the only country on this list never to have wild beavers, as far as we know. Italy has Eurasian beavers, as does Mongolia. And interestingly, beavers were just reintroduced to Mongolia several years ago, so they're making a comeback there too. And then Argentina doesn't have, there are no native beavers in South America, but beavers were actually introduced there also in the kind of the 1940s, and have established a pretty robust invasive population there. So Ireland, an island country, of course, has never had beavers. As far as we know, beavers were very abundant historically in Britain, but there's no historical evidence yet of beavers having lived in Ireland. So good job to the crowd a second time. So anyway, so beavers are increasing their extent all over North America and Europe as well. Eurasian beavers recover pretty dramatically in the 1940s as well, or in the early 1900s. Of course, the most famous beaver reintroduction project, which you've probably all heard of, occurred in Idaho. So there, biologists wanted to reestablish a beaver population in what is today the Frank Church Wilderness area. At first, they tried moving some beavers back there on horseback. The beavers didn't, or the horses rather, didn't take very kindly to that. The beavers didn't love it either. But this is happening in 1948, so it's just post World War II. There were lots of surplus airplanes and parachutes lying around. So one of these guys has the bright idea of airdropping a bunch of beavers into the backcountry. So they designed these special crates with holes in them. And in 1948, they actually airdropped 76 beavers into the Idaho wilderness. 75 of the beavers survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from the crate in midair and fell to his death. Very, very tragic. But the next year, when they flew back over this landscape, they found beaver ponds and wetlands in every place where they dropped these animals. This was actually a very successful and state-of-the-art project at the time. Nobody is airdropping beavers today, to my knowledge. But that was how they did it in the 40s. So all throughout the 20th century, beaver populations are recovering, and they're moving back into their former habitat. The one problem, of course, is that in the intervening years, we've colonized that habitat, right? It turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat is basically one and the same. We both like low gradient streams and broad fertile floodplains. That's where beavers build dams, and that's where humans, of course, build our roads and rail lines and towns and farms and infrastructure. And I would argue that it's us who is the nuisance species more than they are. But there's no question they can be challenging animals to live alongside. Here's a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts that I visited a few years ago, and you can see that beavers had them pretty inoperable pretty quickly. I really like this picture. This is near Taos, New Mexico, and you can see that beavers have taken over this property pretty well. And what's cool about this picture is that here you can see, so the beavers begin their dam in the top left corner of the screen. They dam up to the porch of this house, then they incorporate the house in their dam, and then they continue the dam on the other side. So, I wouldn't want to be that landowner, but you have to admire the ingenuity there. They're really good at making do with whatever nature or humans provide them. Of course, another classic beaver impact, probably the most common source of beaver conflicts in this country is damming and road culverts, right? If you're a beaver, you know, the road bed is this fantastic potential dam, and the culvert, the pipe, is the leak in that dam, and beavers love plugging up leaks, right? So the water level rises, the road washes out. It's very expensive to repair. But you know, they do get more creative in the mischief they cause too. Here's a beaver that broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack when it was apprehended by the authorities. So they cause all kinds of interesting trouble. Of course, the way that those sorts of conflicts are usually handled is by trapping out the offending beaver. Every year, the agency Wildlife Services, a federal agency, branch of the Department of Agriculture, kills about 20,000 beavers. Private nuisance trappers kill tens and probably hundreds of thousands of beavers more. And, you know, of course, lethal trapping makes a certain intuitive sense, right? Beavers causing a problem, get the beaver out of there. But the issue with that is twofold. I mean, first, when you remove the beavers, you're also removing or potentially destroying that pond and wetland habitat they're creating. But the second issue is that, you know, as long as the opportunity for conflict is still there, you know, the problems is going to arise again, right? You just, you know, that culvert is just a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers. So, you know, all over the country, you know, communities have ended up in this very expensive and, I would argue, inhumane cycle of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization. So you start to wonder, you know, maybe there's a better way of solving some of these beaver conflicts. You know, here's a nice one in Colorado. So you know, so every year many beavers are killed for cutting down trees. You know, whether they're fruit trees in orchards or you know, or people's ornamental trees in their backyards. You know, there's lots of beaver removal for the perceived sin of tree felling. And I just don't think that a beaver should ever die for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve. You know, here's a nice example in Colorado. Again, this is a land trust near Salida, and you can see that they wanted to protect these old cottonwoods they had, so they fenced the old cottonwoods, which they wanted to save from the beavers, and then they left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm trees. So that's invasive species control, invasive vegetation management, using beavers as your agent. I think that's a pretty cool case study. You know, when the issue is flooding, that's a harder problem to solve in some ways, but there too, there are plenty of options. This is what's known as a flow device, or you know, you often hear it called the Beaver Deceiver, which is actually a certain brand of flow device. But basically, the concept is that you know, you pass this pipe, this you know, plastic pipe through the beaver dam or through a road culvert, and you're basically creating a leak in the dam, right? You're moving water from the upstream side to the downstream side, lowering the height of that pond to a level that's amenable to both beavers and humans. And research has found that these sorts of contraptions are effective 85 to 95% of the time, and that they can save communities just a huge amount of money. Because again, you know, when you're trapping, I mean, in many places, you know, there are trappers removing beavers from culverts every single year for decades. Whereas, you know, one of these flow devices, you put it in once, and you know, and every you know, once a year you go make sure it's still working, clear off some dead leaves from the outside of the fences, and you're good. So this is, you know, a kind of both a more humane option, a more ecologically sensible option, and in many cases, the math really pencils out in its favor too. And then the other option we have, especially here in Washington State, is relocation, right? Is live trapping nuisance beavers, often on private property, and relocating them to public land. And you know, one thing that you probably don't know about Washington State, but you should be very proud of, is that we actually have the best beaver relocation laws in the country. There was a beaver bill passed a few years ago that basically authorized this work. So in California, by contrast, it's you know, more or less impossible to relocate a beaver. But in Washington, there are probably, you know, 8 or 10 different agencies, nonprofits, native tribes, all relocating beavers. So you should give yourself a pat on the back for living in the country's best beaver state. So take that, Oregon. You know, of course, one thing that you're trying to do when you relocate beavers, of course, is move family units together, right? These are very family-oriented animals. If you move one beaver by him or herself, they're just going to go, shooting off, looking for a mate, wandering around, probably get eaten by a cougar, right? So if you're moving compatible family units, they're going to settle down ideally and build right away where you put them. So here's Sandy and Chomper, the male and female, being relocated to a new home in the Methow Valley up near Winthrop. So Rebecca, here's I think a good point for our third and final trivia question, since we're talking about male and female beavers. So, male beavers, like many mammals, humans are actually kind of aberrant in this way. Male beavers have a bone in their penis. So what do you call that penis bone? And I'll just say, while we're talking here, that this bone is not generally visible, right? Male beavers have internal genitalia, which makes sense, right? If you're an animal that spends its whole life swimming around log jams, you don't want some kind of dangling appendage that's going to get snagged. So beavers keep it nice and tucked up, which means that the only way you can tell a male beaver from a female beaver is actually by smelling their scent secretions that they use to mark their territories. And male beavers smell like motor oil, and female beavers smell like cheese. So now if the opportunity ever arises. And I know that doesn't sound very scientific, but in fact, a beaver biologist can tell with about 99% accuracy, male from female, using the olfactory technique. So that's a fact about beavers that you probably didn't know. So it looks like once again, the crowd is correct. It is the baculum. By a narrow margin. You guys got that one right. So pat on the back again. Well done. So of course, again, just returning to the subject of beaver relocation, obviously when you release those beavers, they don't have a nice deep pond or a lodge in which to take shelter, right? So there are some cases in which there are projects that have moved beavers and have basically fed the resident cougars over the course of many weeks or months. So it's important that beavers have sort of the infrastructure they need to survive when you release them. Here's a kind of an artificial lodge that some beaver biologists built up in the Cascades to give them a nice home to move into. And here's the beaver using his new digs. I like that picture. And then, of course, the other option is to basically build them some dams. This is what's known as a Beaver Dam Analog, basically a human-built artificial beaver dam that creates the conditions in which the genuine animal can come in and thrive and sort of enhance that infrastructure and build dams of their own. So increasingly, these beaver dam analogs are being used as kind of a restoration technique in their own right around the American West, both to slow down water, grade degraded streams, and most importantly, again, to attract the real animals who, of course, do the work a lot better than we do. So this is a very low-tech, low-cost restoration technique. Obviously, the only risk factor is broken fingers. So you gotta watch that sledgehammer. So, what do beavers do exactly that's so wonderful? I've been talking about the importance of keeping beavers on the landscape. I know that I mentioned that they created great fish and wildlife habitat. What else do they do that's so valuable? Why are these animals that we might want around from a kind of a human perspective? What ecosystem services do they provide that we would care about? Well, of course, the first critical thing is they're really good at storing water, right? And with it, restoring these really degraded streams. So here's a kind of a typical stream in Northeast Nevada and Elko County. This is what it looked like in 1980, and this is basically the result of a combination of beaver removal and unmanaged cattle grazing, right? So cows just strip the banks of vegetation. You get this really catastrophic erosion and incision, and you end up with this sort of lifeless channel that looks like something you'd see on Mars probably. So in this case, the Bureau of Land Management and some local ranchers basically began to restore this sort of watershed in the early 1990s. They just kind of changed the grazing regime so that cattle weren't hitting that stream bottom quite as hard. And they put up some riparian fences in some cases, just trying to keep the cows out of the creek. And gradually the vegetation started to regrow. You got some cattail and willow growth back in this channel. And then in the early 2000s, the beavers showed up. Nobody reintroduced beavers. They weren't a focus of the project, but they have this kind of magical way of finding their way into available habitat. So the beavers showed up in the early 2000s and started to go to work. So here's this picture. This is in 1980. The next picture I'm going to show you is the exact same stream in 2017 after about 15 years or so of beaver recovery in this watershed. So keep this picture in mind and then check out this. That's pretty cool, right? That looks pretty good. And you can see that all of this cattail growth is actually growth atop an old beaver dam. So they're really deeply embedded in this system. So, of course, you can just look at this and say, well, clearly that's a healthier body of water than this. But because there were scientists involved, they of course wanted to quantify some of those benefits. And they found that beavers created 20 more acres of open water, right? So they're building dams, impounding a lot of water. That's very obvious. Less obvious is that they added 3 miles of wetted stream length. So what does that mean? Well, back when the channel looked like this, it was so degraded that it was actually going dry before reaching its confluence with the main stem of the Humboldt River. So by building dams and slowing water down, beavers basically ensured there would still be water in the creek in August and September, the hot, dry season. So they basically took this seasonal stream and restored it to being a perennial stream. I think that's just incredible to me. And you hear lots of examples of that. They also saw a 2-foot increase in the water table. So again, what does that mean? Well, in a beaver pond, there's all of the visible surface water you can see, but what you don't see is the weight of that water forcing itself into the ground, hydrating soils, recharging aquifers, raising that water table. That sub-irrigation benefit is really, really huge. And thanks to that sub-irrigation, they saw a 100-acre increase in riparian vegetation in this little valley. So just taking this, brown, dry, degraded valley and making it green and lush again. And that's a big deal for this guy. This is James Rogers. He's a local rancher there in Northeast Nevada. And the point that he made to me is that beavers basically increased grass production on his ranch tenfold, which of course means more weight on his cattle and more money in his back pocket. And I think that's a pretty interesting thing to me. I know that of course you guys live in a very very intensive dairy landscape with a lot of cattle and a lot of grazing. And it is true certainly in general that farmers and ranchers tend to be pretty hostile towards beavers. But now in Northeast Nevada, one of the most conservative places in the country, there's this wonderful progressive cluster of pro-beaver ranchers because they've experienced those sub-irrigation and water creation benefits. Another fabulous beaver benefit that we care about a lot, especially in Puget Sound, a place that's really affected by polluted stormwater runoff, is that beavers filter out pollution, right? When you've got a beaver dam, the water's coming along, hits that beaver dam, the water slows down, it just drops its suspended solids out of the water column. So beavers capture huge amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, heavy metals. All kinds of pollutants and toxins that we want to remediate. They also sequester a lot of carbon too, right? I mean, all of that organic carbon-rich matter that they're trapping at those pond bottoms when you look at the carbon sequestration value of a beaver complex, it's comparable to a similar area of old growth forest. So they're really incredible carbon storers as well. Here's one study that was conducted in England, actually, found that just one pair of beavers over the course of several years captured 100 tons of sediment, 15 tons of carbon, and a ton of nitrogen. So that again, that sort of sediment and pollutant capture benefit is a really big one. Another crucial beaver service is flood control, right? Here's a beaver complex in Scotland, where Eurasian beavers were reintroduced a few years ago. And of course, the UK is it's a very rainy landscape. Every year it's just hammered by destructive flooding. So beavers, by building those dams, spreading water out, storing it in ponds, sinking it into the ground, they're obviously controlling that runoff in a pretty major way. And of course, again, there's lots of peer-reviewed research proving what I'm claiming right now. So I think that's a pretty magical thing about beavers, right? Is that you've got floods, you've got drought, you've got two sort of opposite problems on the hydrograph, and beavers, by regulating flows, are basically helping us solve both of those diametrically opposed problems. I think that's just a really incredible thing. And then the final, fabulous thing that beavers do is that they're wonderful firefighters, right? There's just an emerging body of literature about beavers as creators of fire refugia and fire breaks on the landscape. So here's a fire in Idaho a few years ago, and you can see that all of the uplands are just burnt to a crisp, and the only green, wet, blue, lush place left on that landscape is that beaver-mediated valley bottom. So this is just, of course, we're, the West is getting hotter and drier and more flammable. I know that, all of your air quality is impacted every summer, and, making the landscape a little wetter could I think help a lot. So given all of these wonderful ecological benefits that beavers provide, why do we still kill so many of them? Why aren't they a more accepted creature and feature on the landscape? And to me, I think that's because we suffer from ecological amnesia, right? When we trapped out 400 million beavers a few centuries ago, we changed the land in ways that we don't fully understand, right? And we internalized the concept of a healthy stream being a single thread, free-flowing, fast-moving, cobble-bottomed watercourse, the kind of thing that you would see in a field and stream catalog or something. When in reality, we know that many watersheds were, the historical rule in many places was this sort of, swamp essentially, right? This, beavers, they create still water. There are dead and dying trees everywhere. It all smells kind of funky and decaying. I don't think this is not the kind of stream that you would see in an Orvis catalog. But again, this sort of landscape was in many places much more the historical rule than exception. And as we've seen, is a much healthier aquatic system as well in a lot of ways. So if we're going to fully embrace beavers and restore them to the full extent of their native range, it's going to require reconfiguring our historical imagination and remembering that this sort of landscape is a really healthy, wonderful one. So to sum it all up, we've got this fantastic animal that provides all of these wonderful services. It does it all for free. And best of all, it doesn't need permits. That's really nice from a restoration standpoint. So as the mantra of the Beaver Believer goes, it's time that we stepped back and let the rodent do the work. So with that, I'll say, we can take some questions. I will again reiterate that I wrote a book about this stuff, and that book, I would be very honored and delighted to sell you a signed copy. So if you'd like one, please email me, and there's my email address. So I think with that, we can take some questions.
Thank you, Ben. That was so great. I just learned so much. Even though I'm immersed in the book, it's really awesome to have the visuals. So thank you. We do have a number of questions, and the first one that I think is kind of interesting is that Carl said a federal law says no net loss of wetlands. So how can beaver ponds be legally drained?
Well, I mean, yes, there are a few ways. I mean, yeah, it's certainly possible that whoever's draining beaver ponds is also, buying credits from a mitigation bank, right? There are wetland mitigation banks that allow you to drain a wetland in one place and compensate by, essentially buying credits for wetland restoration elsewhere. But but I think in most places, it's just yeah, I mean that benefit is just not widely acknowledged. And I will say that in many cases, beavers are actually even seen as an impediment to stream restoration projects. When you buy a wetland mitigation credit, that credit is often for a certain type of ecosystem. So we're going to restore 10 acres of in the southeast, it would be like bottomland hardwood forest. And if beavers come in and turn that that stream corridor hardwood forest into a wetland, they're considered an obstacle to restoration and are actually removed in many cases. So we're still very far from acknowledging their full role in wetland creation and restoration.
What's the current population?
Yeah, good question.
Population.
Yeah, so there are again very few reliable estimates. As far as I know, no state does any kind of systematic statewide beaver population survey. But the best guess we have is 10 to 15 million beavers in North America. So obviously they're not an endangered species. They're not going to go extinct anytime soon or ever probably. They're too adaptable for that. But we're at a tiny fraction of their historic abundance. Again, obviously, historically there were several hundred million beavers, and now we've got 10 million. So there are beavers in 49 of the 50 states. Of course, there are no beavers in Hawaii. So they've recolonized much of their historic range. But obviously there are lots and lots of individual watersheds that don't have beavers right now. So that's I think that's what we have to get back to, of course, is targeting some of the watersheds that would historically have had beavers and are now beaverless.
Well, that sort of leads to one of the next questions. And I have a little anecdote here. One day I was walking on the beach down on the Port Townsend beach, and I saw an otter walking along the beach, and it actually turned out to be an otter that had a flat tail and very large incisors. So the question is, how far will beavers travel, like in the Maggie Creek example? And my question, relates to, it was on a shoreline, a saltwater shoreline. So just curious about how far they'll travel.
Yeah, I mean, certainly they can disperse very widely. There was one beaver that was relocated by the Methow Beaver Project in the Methow Valley. So all of those beavers have pit tags, little salmon tags inserted in their tail, so you can track them moving through the watershed like a salmon. And there that beaver swam down the Twist River, down the Methow River, into the Columbia, and then like 200 miles up the Columbia. So that was something like a 280 mile journey. I think that's pretty abnormal, but certainly gives you an indication of how far they're capable of moving. It all depends on the available habitat. If they find good habitat, a half mile downstream from their parents, that's where they'll settle. But they're very territorial animals, and they will fight even occasionally to the death. If an intruder shows up. So if you're in a place that already has a pretty dense beaver population, those beavers might have to move a very long way, looking for a territory. And of course, that's the most dangerous period of a beaver's life, right? Is that those 2-year-old dispersers, they don't have a lodge, they don't have a dam yet, they don't have that deep impoundment. So that's when they're most vulnerable to predation. As for the saltwater beavers, that's a fascinating story. Actually, I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago after the book came out. So beavers, they do disperse using salt water. They'll go from river mouth to river mouth very readily, at times over very long distances. There are also beavers in many tidal estuaries in Washington's rivers, in the Skagit and the Snohomish, the Elwha, and there are these intertidal beavers. This is a phenomenon that I haven't really heard of outside of coastal Washington, but they basically build dams that, when the tide comes up, the dams are actually fully submerged by the tide. So you could kayak over them and not even know they were there. And then when the tide goes out, there's a nice little pool of a little bathtub of water being held behind that dam. So they're intertidal beavers, which I think is pretty amazing. But the issue is that, of course, beavers, they're a freshwater aquatic animal. So I've heard a number of cases of beavers being reported to various wildlife rehabbers and veterinarians with salt toxicity, which is presumably the result of spending too much time at sea. So they live in these estuaries, seemingly pretty happily, but too much saltwater exposure. They're not seals. So yeah, very interesting animals. There's a lot we still don't know about beavers.
Yeah, I have to say that that beaver on the beach didn't look very happy, actually.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So Michael asks, what's the aging cycle of a beaver? The lifespan, the number of offspring, mate for life, or in Michael humor, the use of eHarmony?
Yeah, they as far as I know, they don't use Tinder or any other dating apps, but they do generally mate for life. They're considered monogamous. And yeah, those it's sort of 2 years old they sexually mature, and those 2-year-olds are basically looking for a mate, and then they'll have kits every spring, basically for their lives, and then they in the wild, an old beaver would be 12 years old or so, that they'd be getting up there at that point. I think the oldest beaver I have heard of in captivity was 19. I think so. Yeah, they're fairly long lived, and certainly for a rodent, they're very long lived.
Have you ever been inside a beaver lodge?
I have been in a beaver lodge. Yeah, I have been in a sort of a beaver lodge that was half destroyed, and it was it seemed pretty cozy in there. They're very sort of fastidious, meticulous animals. So the floor of the lodge is lined with wood chips, which they sort of cut off trees. So it's it's like a hamster cage or something. They're very meticulous animals. They don't poop in the lodge, so they keep it very clean. I did get a picture last year from a father and son, also in Montana, who actually spent the night in a beaver lodge, and they said it was pretty cozy. And it's very warm in there. They kind of pack the sides with mud, so it's very well insulated. There's a good study somewhere in northern Canada, basically showing that in the depths of the Canadian winter, when it's 40 degrees below zero, it's actually above freezing inside the lodge, because it's it's so well insulated, and of course they have their little warm bodies that heat it up pretty good. So yeah, the lodge seems like a cozy place.
Can you speak a little to the use of Beaver Dam Analogs in stream restoration?
Yeah, definitely. So, again, so Beaver Dam Analogs, there's sort of those artificial human-built beaver dams, and they're increasingly prevalent now. There are lots and lots of stream restoration projects all over the country that incorporate Beaver Dam Analogs, and it basically, so of course the issue with one of the big issues with sort of those really incised streams that I showed you earlier that have lost their beavers is that once a stream loses beavers, it degrades in ways that make it really hard for a beaver to resettle there, right? So when you've got a stream that's kind of locked within its banks, that flow is just concentrated like a fire hose. And if you as a beaver tried to build a dam in there, it would just get blasted out by the force of the water. So, in those cases, that's really where a Beaver Dam analog comes in, right? Because, we can use a sledgehammer, or a hydraulic post pounder to knock a few posts into the stream bed and, give them some more stable structure. And then, and of course, those Beaver Dam analogs, they're also capturing lots of sediment, right? They're aggrading that stream bed, and they're basically giving the stream a chance to access the floodplain again. So to me, there are lots of places where Beaver Dam analogs are being used sort of by themselves as a restoration tool, and certainly there's value there. But for me, their greatest value is just as a beaver recruitment tool, right? You're taking a stream that currently geomorphologically can't support beavers, and and you're creating some stable structure. You're rebuilding that stream bed a little bit, allowing them to access the floodplain again, and basically creating the conditions in which beavers can reestablish in the watershed. So I think that Beaver Dam analogs as a kind of a precursor or prelude to the genuine article. That's really you need the real things too.
Well, that's actually a really good segue into a question from Dee, and that is, what can we do to support beavers living along Chimacum Creek and Beaver Valley? Her comment is that coho in the creek desperately need help. And this question kind of relates back to some of my introduction, which was talking about the beaver attitudes that we have here, and some of the challenges that some of the farmers experience with beaver, but also some of the opportunities that we have. So I'd be really curious what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Fortunately, there are some great groups in Western Washington that do sort of beaver restoration. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the group called Beavers Northwest, which is based in Seattle, but Beavers Northwest is a great resource. And I would say, right, it's obviously it's very hard to convince a landowner to stop killing the beavers on his property. That's just certainly that has happened. There are people who have seen the light and gone from beaver hater to beaver believer, but of course a lot of people are very entrenched. So I would look for opportunities. I would look for places where beavers are being killed currently at public sites, right? So as I said earlier, the biggest cause or source of beaver conflicts in the country is road culverts. That's where the most quote unquote nuisance beavers get killed. So I would talk to whoever it is, the county road crew, or if it's town road, the town the town commission or whoever it is, or if it's the state DOT, in certain cases I would find a way to influence that road culvert conflict. Because that's where a lot of beavers get killed, and and again, if the goal is to install one of those flow devices, which really can solve those conflicts at culverts, Beavers Northwest does that work. So I would start there. I think that's like, of course there are all of these things we can do. We can relocate beavers, reintroduce them. We can build Beaver Dam analogs. But at the end of the day, we need to stop killing them. They're very resourceful animals. They reproduce really quickly, and if we just lay off killing them every time they cause a conflict, we can really make a lot of progress very quickly. So I would start by looking into that culvert issue, finding out if beavers are being trapped at culverts, and then solve that problem.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Michael's asking, has anyone found late Pleistocene beaver dams in the sedimentary record? They were considerably larger, i.e. 200 pounds.
Yeah, so there were, as Michael says, there were these sort of giant Pleistocene beavers. Castoroides ohioensis was the species. The best evidence we have suggests that they were not dam builders. That they sort of lived a more hippo-like lifestyle. That they didn't fell trees, as far as we know. They ate aquatic vegetation, and interestingly, that's probably why Castor canadensis, our modern beavers, survived, while Castoroides ohioensis, the giant beaver, went extinct, right? Because, you know, during times of drought, you know, our beavers could build dams and basically enhance their own habitat, whereas, you know, these giant non-dam building beavers could not do so. So that's, you know, I think that's a really important point to remember too, is just that, you know, these are amazing animals. They really engineer their own habitat in a way that no species besides Homo sapiens really does. And we should appreciate that incredible aptitude and gift that they have.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Ben. I'm gonna want to watch this again because I just really did learn a lot, and I understand that you're doing another presentation over in Chelan too in the near future. This will be recorded, and so folks can watch this again, as Michael mentioned earlier. But you've got another one on your books soon too.
Yeah, that's right. That one is on April 1st, I believe.
Great. Well, do you have any other closing comments you want to make? Or I know we just really appreciate your time today.
No, just that I'm so grateful that you guys had me, and that all of you came to watch, and thank you so much for supporting the beavers in your community. You live in a really special place. You know, it's funny, living here in Spokane. You know, the Spokane River used to have some of the biggest Chinook salmon in the Columbia Basin, and you know, now we don't. We've lost our anadromous fish. So I think it's just really special that you folks live in a place that still has that ancient beaver salmonid connection, and I hope that continues.
Thanks again. I really enjoyed it. I know there are lots of comments coming in saying this was really lovely. People really enjoyed it. So thanks again, Ben.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right. Take care.